Good evening from Washington and good morning to our friends in Asia. Welcome to this virtual fireside chat at the Center for a New American Security. My name is Jacob Stokes. I'm a fellow here in the center's Indo-Pacific Security Program, where I lead our work on China and political and security issues in East Asia, including on the Korean Peninsula. Tonight's event will have two parts. We'll begin with a fireside chat with our very special guest, Dr. Jung Pak, for the first 30 minutes. And then we'll move on to an expert panel discussion for the final hour. We're speaking tonight as South Korea has just elected a new president and North Korea continues on a record spree of missile testing. So it's a very timely set of topics. In the interest of time, I want to dive right into the interview with Dr. Jung Pak. Dr. Pak is the Deputy Special Representative for North Korea and simultaneously serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Multilateral Affairs and Global China Issues at the U.S. Department of State. Prior to arriving at State, she was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she focused on Korean Peninsula issues, East Asia regional dynamics, and transnational threats. While at Brookings, she authored the book Becoming Kim Jong Un, which has been translated into multiple languages and draws from her deep knowledge and experience as an intelligence officer. Dr. Pak has held several senior positions at the Central Intelligence Agency and served as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Korea at the National Intelligence Council. Before her career in national security, Dr. Pak taught at U.S. history at Hunter College in New York City. She received her PhD from Columbia University and studied in South Korea as a Fulbright scholar. Dr. Pak is a graduate of Colgate University, where she is a trustee emerita and a recipient of an honorary doctorate. Dr. Pak, a very warm welcome to you. We're honored to have you here with us virtually at CNAS, and so grateful that you took the time out of your schedule, which we know is extra busy right now, to share your insights with us.
Thanks, Jake, and thanks for that warm welcome. It's great to see old colleagues, and thank you for joining me today. Jake, you asked me to start with just a few minutes of our policy approach, so let me begin there, and then we'll go to your our chat. As you already know, our goal remains the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The Biden administration is pursuing a practical, calibrated approach to diplomacy that increases the security of the United States, our allies, and our deployed forces. We are taking calibrated responses to the DPRK's increasingly escalatory actions, and based on the degree of threat they pose to the United States and our allies. We have condemned the DPRK's 11 ballistic missile launches this year, all of which violated multiple Security Council resolutions. The most recent launches on February 26 and March 4th were of particular concern. After careful analysis, the United States government concluded those two tests involved a new intercontinental ballistic missile system that is being developed by the regime. The system was originally unveiled during the Korean Workers' Party parade on October 10th, 2020. This is a serious escalation by the DPRK. I would note that unlike the DPRK's 3 ICBM tests in 2017, neither of these launches demonstrated ICBM range. These launches were likely intended to test elements of the new system before the DPRK conducts a launch at full range, which they will potentially attempt to disguise as a space launch. We made this assessment in close coordination with our allies in the Republic of Korea and Japan. And we have also shared further details of these tests with other allies and partners, including at the United Nations. The DPRK's increasingly destabilizing behavior poses a threat to regional security that we take very seriously and are working to address. As you may have seen, the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command ordered intensified intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance collection activities in the Yellow Sea and enhanced readiness among our ballistic missile defense forces in the region. We continued to work closely with the ROC, Japan, and other allies on how best to engage and respond to its actions. In addition, as many of you have probably seen, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released its unclassified annual threat assessment this week. Having worked on this particular assessment for the past several years when I was in the intel business, it takes a lot of work and a lot of thought into producing this report. The report detailed the DPRK's efforts to expand and enhance weapons capabilities and predicted the DPRK may resume nuclear and ICBM testing. Having said all this, I want to reiterate what we have said many times before. The United States remains open to serious and sustained diplomacy with the DPRK. We have made clear that we harbor no intention toward the DPRK and are prepared to meet without preconditions. We are concerned that the DPRK's self-imposed isolation has worsened an already tenuous humanitarian situation. Its stringent COVID-19 measures have significantly hindered the efforts of humanitarian organizations, UN agencies, and other countries to deliver aid to those most in need. We support and encourage the efforts of US and international health and aid organizations as they seek to prevent and contain the spread of COVID-19 in the DPRK and to provide other forms of humanitarian assistance to vulnerable groups in the country. Along these lines, the US government is involved in efforts to facilitate the provision of humanitarian aid to the neediest North Koreans. This is most evident in our ongoing work to expedite sanctions exemption approvals in the UN 1718 Committee for COVID-related aid, and to quickly review other applications to deliver life-saving aid to the DPRK. And we hope that the DPRK will soon open its borders to this assistance. That's a lot that I shared with you. This is hot off the presses, as these are recently breaking developments. So I know you have a lot of questions, Jake, and so let me stop there on the policy approach overall.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pak. That was such a fantastic overview of where we stand today in the Biden administration's approach. One question I had, as you said, Washington and Pyongyang are at a diplomatic impasse right now. The administration officials have offered to engage in talks without preconditions, as you said, but haven't received an affirmative response from North Korea. To what should we attribute Pyongyang's reluctance to talk? What is Kim Jong Un waiting for specifically? And what are our confidence levels on those assessments?
Thanks, Jake. So I think the way I want to address that is that you've heard us say multiple times, and we've been very open about it, about the private and public outreach to the DPRK on multiple occasions since this administration came to power. And that's consistent with our policy approach, reduce the threat and also continue to reach out to the DPRK. Unlike in my previous life in the think tank, I don't want to speculate on what Pyongyang's intentions are on policy decisions made in Pyongyang. But we, as you've heard the Deputy Secretary and the Secretary say that we harbor no hostile intent. And the situation is such that it's important for the DPRK and the US to come to talk and discuss matters of mutual concern. Having said that, though, I want to add that our desire for diplomacy and dialogue with the DPRK is not going to prevent us from calling out its bad behavior, is because we are committed to enforcing the sanctions and abiding by our international obligations.
Thank you. Another question I had is that, some experts have called for the US and the international community to try to sort of jumpstart diplomacy by offering inducements to North Korea, ranging from vaccines to, on the more extreme end, partial sanctions relief. And of course, others have called for additional sanctions and pressure on both North Korea and its supporters, namely China and also to some extent Russia as well. Is the administration thinking about changes to US policy to try to do that jumpstart, to shift the dynamic whether via inducements or additional pressure?
Thanks. I think we're going to continue with this practical and calibrated approach. I think it makes the most sense, responding and being forward-leaning, and we may remain committed to our international obligations with the UNSCRs, and of course the driver for that is to make sure that we constrain the resources that the DPRK has available to continue its unlawful WMD programs. I know that there's been, as you mentioned, some calls for reducing sanctions or lifting sanctions, or putting a lot on the table to get the DPRK to talk to us. But I would strongly disagree with those who would offer sanctions relief to the DPRK, even as we know that they're advancing and demonstrating its nuclear weapons capabilities. But despite that, as I mentioned before, really want to foot stomp that we want to make sure and strongly encourage the efforts of aid organizations on the COVID issue. The administration has been pretty clear that that we want to make sure that COVID is wiped out, that we're not safe unless everybody is safe on the COVID issue. And so we hope that the DPRK will be open to all of these offers. We know that COVAX has offered vaccine assistance, and the previous administration has offered pandemic-related assistance as well. We currently have no plans to provide vaccines to the DPRK, but we support efforts in this regard. And we'll continue to support international efforts at trying to mitigate whatever health concerns that are affecting the most vulnerable North Koreans inside the country.
Thank you. That was very useful. I'd like to move now to cooperation with allies, and especially in the region, but also sort of like-minded partners as well. Of course, South Korea just elected a new president, and Japan's Prime Minister Kishida is still relatively new in office. And certainly many of us took note in the Indo-Pacific strategy about the focus on trilateral cooperation as a major tenet of the strategy. How will the leadership change in Seoul potentially affect negotiations with North Korea, as well as prospects for trilateral cooperation with Tokyo? And if I might just add another piece to the question, I noticed recently more broader multilateral statements coming out of our office, our UN office in New York. I wonder if you can talk about those efforts as well.
When I first started in this job, one of the first thing that the goals and really the tenets of this of our approach to all of our challenges is allies and partners. That the challenges are great, and that we're stronger when we work with allies and partners. So I would say that so a lot of my time has been in making sure that I'm briefing, I'm sharing, that we're sharing with each other, we're coordinating, we're syncing up. So as you can imagine, since North Korea's since the year started, there's been a serious volley of missile launches that required a lot of conversations and across both oceans to make sure that our allies and partners are with us and sharing our approach with them. And I think with respect to the DPRK issue, from the very beginning, starting with the policy review that we did last spring, the ROC in Japan were with us every step of the way. Their views were incorporated into our policy review, and neither side was surprised when our policy review was, when we started talking about it in public last late spring, early summer last year. So, and I think a robust trilateral cooperation is incredibly important on the DPRK issue, certainly. But you may have also noticed that there's been an expansive range of things that we're talking about trilaterally. And we're talking about things like climate change building secure and resilient supply chains, promoting regional peace and economic security, and bolstering the rule of law. So all of these are shared, shared concerns that we seek to work across the board with ROC and Japan. And I think we've continued to reach out and talk to the ROC and Japan counterparts across all levels. I had the opportunity to be with Secretary Clinton, Secretary Blinken, when we went in Hawaii for a trilateral with his ROC and Japan counterparts. That was, and of course, Special Representative Kim was there as well to meet with his special representative counterparts from ROC and Japan. So there's a broad understanding and a desire for the three countries to work on this issue, but also to see where we can go on other issues of concern that affect us all.
Thank you. Wonder now if you could talk about the role that we see China playing in the negotiations under the current Biden administration. Certainly, we know that U.S.-China strategic competition is something of an organizing principle for U.S. foreign policy, regionally to some extent and globally as well. And I know you also wear a China hat to some extent in your role at State. In that context, how should we think about Beijing's role as we go forward, seeking to engage fruitfully with North Korea, but also sustain deterrence?
Right. Thanks. A piece of that China approach is strategic competition. That's going to be the dominating narrative. But we're going to pursue areas of cooperation where it makes sense. And I think that the unprecedented number of DPRK ballistic missile launches since January of this year, and of course, the missile testing started in September as well, that it's in nobody's interest for DPRK to continue these escalatory activities, including, and it's not in China's interest either. We have urged the PRC and Russia, for that matter, to fully implement the UN Security Council resolutions that all member states have unanimously adopted, that we need to be vigilant about sanctions implementation, DPRK's sanctions evasion activities. I think we believe that the PRC can play a constructive role by encouraging the DPRK to halt its provocative behavior and engage in sustained dialogue. I'll continue to push on that, and we'll continue to see where we can work with PRC. I think it's what's concerning, as you've seen in the recent U.S. government statement about the last two launches, that it's really important for us to see where we can make progress on this issue.
Well, thank you. And I want to transition now, if I can. I know I can't go too much into your previous life as a think tanker, but you did write a great book that came out in 2020 called Becoming Kim Jong Un. And of course, you studied him during your time in the intelligence community. We noted last December that Kim Jong Un marked a decade in power as North Korea's leader. I wonder if you could go ahead and reflect on what we've seen during the decade. In particular, has he turned out to be the type of leader we expected him to be a decade ago when he came to power? And also, has he done anything that's truly surprised you?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jake. I think working on as a lot of working on the DPRK issue takes a lot of patience. Sometimes it feels like you're living, it's Groundhog's Day, with the missile tests. And so this file, and working in the State Department too, and having worked this in my previous positions, requires a lot of patience and a lot of thoughtful checking of assumptions and reassessing and sharing assessments. And I don't think that we can expect quick results or success overnight. And looking at the long-term perspective, what I wanted to get out in the book is that that the leaders, whoever the leaders might be, in this case Kim Jong Un, he has agency, and that he is an actor in this unfolding history. That on the missile issue or on domestic policy issues or domestic approach that Kim is working on. So I think we can't expect quick success or quick progress or things to happen right away. And if we look at Kim as an actor and with agency, I think it's important to kind of understand that we can only do so much in offering dialogue if the other side is not interested. And in the end, we need the DPRK to say yes and come to the table. And one of the longer term aspects that I've been thinking about recently is, and maybe those in the audience are already working on this, is what would DPRK look like in the next 10 years, or in the more immediate term, what will it look like in the post-pandemic world, whenever that may be, and hopefully that post-pandemic world will come sooner rather than later. A lot of you folks on the call have probably written lots of things about some of the economic changes and social political changes that are happening inside the country. Certainly there have been a lot of changes in the way as a result of the border closures. The DPRK pretty much locked down pretty quickly back in January of 2020. What is a sustained lockdown over the past 3 years during the pandemic mean for what's happening or percolating inside? And what does that mean for diplomacy? What does that mean for Kim's decision-making calculus? So all of that stuff is evolving. And what will that look like in terms of who gets to go back into the country? As you know, a lot of foreign diplomats and most of the aid workers have had no choice but to leave Pyongyang. Can we be confident that the same people will be allowed back in? And what will they find once they do get back in, and whatever that may be? It might not be for another year or so, as we're still, battling the pandemic. And what will be the state of its economy? What does it mean when a country that has relied so much on smuggling and gray markets and black markets, and it had seen a flourishing of semi-private and private enterprise over the past couple of decades? What does it mean when that's kind of shut down or constrained or limited by COVID and by the regime's desire to make sure that its borders are closed? And what does that mean for North Korea-China relations? Clearly much more dependent on China for its livelihood. And so, I mean, those are lots of really open-ended questions. I think it's a lot to chew on. And given the fact that there are not many people inside the country giving us ground truth, that I think I'll be really interested in what the economists and the sociologists and the historians might say about, or comparative historians or political scientists, to extrapolate what we might see in a post-pandemic DPRK. And what does that mean for policy? What does that mean for the Korean Peninsula? What does it mean for inter-Korean relations? What does it mean for North Korea-China relations? What does it mean for U.S.-China relations? So I think, and I continue to say that Kim is learning, right? And he is also adapting. These are new, unprecedented conditions. No one, this pandemic has changed all of us. How has it changed Kim? And so I think, if there are studies out there, and I continue to think about this, and I continue to discuss this with my team here and within the interagency. I think that's would be really interesting to kind of tease that out.
Wow, thank you. That was such an amazing overview. And I think you, especially for those of us working in the think tank space, you've written us quite an agenda to try to get to work through. I know today is an incredibly busy day for you, and I want to be conscious of your time. So I will go ahead and wrap up there and let you get back to the very important work you're doing. Dr. Pak, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was such an insightful presentation. I really learned a lot, and I know the audience did too. And I do want to take a moment too to say thanks as well for your service to the country, to allies in the world in a very tough job. We're really lucky to have you there. So we'll let you go back to work now, and thanks again.
Thanks, Jake. Really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to you all. Take care.
Have a good night. Thank you. At this time, I'll go ahead and hand it over to my colleague, Joshua Fitt, who will moderate the panel portion of the event.
Thank you so much, Jake. Really appreciate it. And that was a really fantastic discussion. So welcome everyone to the next phase of our event this evening. So as Jake mentioned at the top of his fireside chat with Das Pak, there's a lot going on right now on both the North Korea and South Korea fronts. So I'm immensely lucky to be joined tonight by a stellar panel of experts who can walk us through the latest developments and the potential way forward as well. So with us tonight, we have Frank Aum, who is a senior expert on Northeast Asia at the United States Institute of Peace. We have Dr. Dooyeon Kim, who's a columnist for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and an adjunct senior fellow with the CNAS Indo-Pacific Security Program. We have Dr. Jung Pak, who is director of the Korea Project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and an adjunct senior fellow with the CNAS Indo-Pacific Security Program. And lastly, we have Jake Stokes, who you all know well by now, who is a fellow with the CNAS Indo-Pacific Security Program. So I have a number of questions prepared for our panelists tonight, but I do hope to make this an interactive session. So to that end, you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and some of you had put that to good use in the first part of this event as well, but please feel free to send questions through the Q&A button throughout the session. So I'll attempt to weave them in as they become relevant to the conversation rather than holding them all to the end. So with that, to kick things off, Dooyeon, you wrote a CNAS report in June 2019 titled "Negotiating Toward a Denuclearization Peace Roadmap on the Korean Peninsula." So a lot has happened since then, even honestly in the past 24 hours. But the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia started a war with Ukraine. There are new administrations in Washington and a new one headed in Seoul. And now the administration appears poised to announce new sanctions tomorrow in light of the tests over the past couple of weeks. So in light of these developments, I'm wondering, have your calculations from that initial report changed? And if you could add an addendum to the report, what would you include?
Thanks so much, Josh, and for CNAS for having this excellent and timely event. So basically, that report that I wrote was intended to be a guide for U.S. negotiators, regardless of time, really. I mean, of course, it was focused on the Trump administration at the time, but I was asked to write it so that it would stand the test of time as well. So something that I would change would, of course, be context, the situational context of the time. And of course, I would change some of the timetables that I had laid out. Back then, the Trump administration wanted to do things in 2 years, which was impossible. And so you'll see that I have different phases of negotiations and different asks and demands from the US government to North Korea to do on denuclearization. And I would write, I suggested do something by a certain year, and I wrote comma if possible. So you'll see the words if possible a lot. But of course, in a real situation, you can't do any of these phases in such a short period of time. But in terms of the principles of negotiations, and the strategies and the guiding principles for strategies. The broad brush strokes remain the same. Things like proportionate bargaining, how to conduct proportionate bargaining. Of course, between or among like the moderate and medium and high value concessions for both US and North Korea, we can kind of play around with like the detailed components within them. And I wrote specifically in the report that these can change depending on the trajectory of negotiations. But also, but the main principle really is not to give up too much for too little in return. So that's the main guiding principle. And things like, I wrote about things like expected pitfalls and expected challenges and North Korea's negotiating style and the way that they'll try to cheat, the way that they'll try to salami slice and expand and extend, prolong negotiations. Those types of elements would more or less be quite consistent. We'll see these themes coming up. We've seen these themes come up throughout the history of negotiations with North Korea. And you'll see in that report, even though it is technically dated, you'll see some of the lessons learned from previous administrations and in their negotiations.
Fantastic, thank you. Frank, I'd love to bring you in. So you recently wrote about the potential risks and rewards of an end of war declaration, which has often been brought up as a potential step in this negotiation process. So practically speaking, what do you expect an end of war declaration would mean for US DPRK relations, US ROK relations, and ROK DPRK relations? Considering Pyongyang's nuclear development trajectory and the overall stagnation of diplomatic efforts, what is sort of the rationale or the pitch inside Washington for putting that declaration on the table?
Well, first of all, I want to thank CNAS, Jake, and you, Josh, for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Regarding an end of war declaration, I'll be brief. This idea is dead in the water with the election of Yoon Suk-yeol. Remember, the only reason an end of war declaration idea had any traction was because Moon Jae-in made it his priority to help jumpstart negotiations with North Korea. I expect Yoon to drop the idea and the Biden administration to be happy about it. There's a reason that an end of war declaration concept went into hibernation between the time President Roh Moo-hyun raised it in 2007 and when President Moon reintroduced the idea in 2018, right? I think the new Yoon administration, as well as the likelihood of a new cycle of more inflammatory provocations from North Korea, the Biden administration will have different kinds of challenges to contend with in managing alliance relations with South Korea, which we can get to later. But I will say that even though the end of war declaration idea is dead for now, the broader approach of taking diplomatic risks to re-engage with North Korea is still something that Washington and Seoul should consider. And I say this because, for most of the last 70 years, and particularly over the last decade, I think Washington has viewed the North Korea challenge primarily through the lens of a security threat, right? Meaning that the fear of North Korean aggression, brinkmanship, and instability based on the country's provocative behavior since 1950 has shaped how the US sees its objectives and risks on the Korean Peninsula. And in turn, this security-focused perspective has led to approaches that focus primarily on how to deter, contain, and defeat the North Korean threat. And this has meant policies that rely heavily on military deterrence and supremacy, economic pressure, and diplomatic isolation. And I think these tools have largely been successful in achieving their intended objectives, particularly preventing a war, but they've also been severely inadequate in addressing the other important goals of building peace, improving relations, and enhancing mutual understanding with North Korea. These additional goals require different tools such as diplomatic risk-taking, confidence-building measures, and enhanced engagement. So, it's no surprise to me that under this prevailing security paradigm, there have been very few sustained peace-building efforts on the Korean Peninsula during the last 70 years. And also, that we've maintained a status quo that both preserves the armistice and deters major conflict, but also on the other hand, doesn't advance peace and instead has heightened tensions and fueled a regional arms race. So my larger point is that the end of war declaration is not happening, but the rationale that undergirds it is still there. I think everyone on this panel and most people in DC would support some sort of process with North Korea where both sides take incremental, reciprocal, proportional steps towards denuclearization and confidence building, and Duyan referred to it too. But the reality is that the US will need to take greater diplomatic risks to deal with a country like North Korea that is isolated and insecure, but it is also proud and possesses nuclear weapons, right? And I think given the US's robust diplomatic, military, and economic position relative to North Korea, especially when you're talking about it in alliance with South Korea, we have the right foundation from which to start taking diplomatic risks, including taking the first unilateral step to begin the process. Otherwise, I think we'll face a situation where North Korea will dictate the narrative and game, starting with greater provocations that we're seeing, perhaps even a satellite launch in April. And they'll do this to increase their leverage and try to pressure the US back into talks on their terms. And then, of course, the US will want to look like it's punishing rather than rewarding bad behavior. So we'll get into an extended cycle of more UN Security Council resolutions, more US legislation that ties the hands of our diplomats to negotiate, and more military enhancements from both North Korea as well as the US-ROC alliance. And I don't think this is a healthy cycle to get into.
Absolutely. And I can't think of a better lead into my question to you, John, about so your recent report through CNAS, in which you advocate that the administration adopt a flywheel approach, what you call a flywheel approach, or that leverages the flywheel effect, rather. Can you walk us through the idea behind that approach and how it differs from what the United States has attempted to achieve over the past 2 decades?
Sure. Thanks very much, Josh. And thanks very much to CNAS for putting this event together. I think when we look at the negotiating track record in dealing with North Korea, you see a lot of concerted efforts as there's a warming up and eventually a building up to being at the negotiating table, sustained dialogue, sustained negotiations, and even in key instances, the signing of agreements. We've also subsequently seen those agreements fall apart. As our group did a forensic investigation of all of those previous agreements, we looked for common factors and themes. And based on that, the idea of the flywheel effect is to draw on a comparison. If we look at previous negotiating efforts as essentially cold starts leading up to an understanding of the other side, and through that understanding, developing an agreement and trying to move forward on an agreement, there are elements of essentially a barter system as you're trying to figure out what is the value of something, how does the other side see the value? One of the benefits of that track record is we have a ballpark idea. Those were episodes where through many strenuous rounds of negotiations, they arrived at a sense of what the value is. Those values are not fixed in time, but one thing that the flywheel effect and the concept of it and at the heart of the report is to link that to more of a marketplace. So if you think of, for particular types of items, actions that the North Koreans would take, actions the United States would take in close coordination with friends and allies in the region, what would that look like if we first break it down into a list of small for small actions, and then linking that as you see progress in the small for small actions to the big for big. And so basically you're looking at freezing of Yongbyon, some aspects of maybe drawing down, definitely on the risk reduction component. And as there is progress, linking that to essentially the understanding that you can accelerate to the larger type of activities. Where in the small for small, you'll see aspects of pairing up to sanctions easing, but only based on track record of activity. This isn't something that would be sequential where you put the sanctions easing on the table first. In the subsequent part where you look at the large for large type of actions, there are bigger items related to lifting of sanctions, but those are commensurate to the type of, if you think of a parity aspect of it, what would the equivalent action be from the other side? So if we can map this out and present this and using track 1.5 as a connected means for channel of communication, I think there is an opportunity to flesh out the details of what both sides have laid out in the past, but see how things have changed. The two things I'll mention related to the flywheel effect is context is important. This is happening in the context of growing US-China competition. In the past, we saw a lot of cooperation between the United States and China when there was progress in negotiations with North Korea. Clearly, there's a different political landscape. But one thing to lock in that competitive situation here, the way that China is interacting with North Korea and the way the US is interacting with North Korea, we definitely have to take stock. As we heard with Pak and what she mentioned in terms of what would a post-COVID world look like, how would the relations between the various countries, and particularly the relationship between China and North Korea evolve? I think one of the key indicators right now is that there's a greater dependency from North Korea on China. I think there are some opportunities that we can further explore in that. But the bottom line is the Chinese primary focus on the stability of the North Korean regime has led to a set of actions that, frankly, inviting top North Korean state trading companies to operate freely in the Chinese marketplace with zero strings attached to denuclearization in order to advance Chinese national interests related to the stability of the North Korean regime are happening in a way that makes negotiating approaches from the US side that much more difficult. The final thing I mentioned with respect to the flywheel effect is that it does require a great deal of coordination. This isn't something that would be done bilaterally solely. So there would be the coordination among the friends and allies as we move forward to this. But laying out some baselines and understandings, I think this is, again, where the track 1.5 dialogues connected and with the understanding that messages are sent back and forth with Washington and Pyongyang. Track 1.5 in this sense, I think, can be an important mechanism through which you can lay out some of the understandings related to the broader concept of flywheel effect and how would it play out for the small for small in the beginning, and then working towards the large for large. The final thing I'd mention is that this is something where locking in previous concerns and current concerns, that if we do initiate something like a small for small aspect of North Korean actions commensurate to easing of sanctions, that North Korea could lock in gains and essentially end that process. That could be true, but one of the things that would definitely stop the process, and we wouldn't get to the stage of large for large. But again, it's a holistic approach and building on, I think, the very important foundation of a practical and calibrated approach. This is one to essentially lay out the bigger pieces and how they would all connect.
Thanks, John. And so, Jake, John mentioned the evolving situation in U.S.-China relations, obviously affecting the way that our diplomatic engagement with North Korea is the effects of our diplomatic engagement with North Korea. So I'd love to ask your thoughts on this, given your recent CNAS report, Tangled Threats. You write about something that's at the crux of this exact challenge, which is integrating the U.S. approaches to China and North Korea. So why, can you just touch on why is that integration so important? And given that importance, why are there so many structural barriers to doing so in Washington? And lastly, what's the biggest misunderstanding or oversight, that makes this such an enduring problem for policymakers here?
Well, thanks for that question, Josh. And let me just say it's an honor to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues. So the ideas in this paper came to me during my time working in the US government in both the executive and the legislative branches, as I was often asked whether China is North Korea's ally or rival, and whether Beijing is a partner or an obstacle for shaping North Korea's behavior. And this was sort of my attempt to answer those questions. I called my report Tangled Threats, as you said, because in it I argue that North Korea essentially plays 4 important roles in China's foreign policy. The first one is that North Korea helps divert geopolitical attention away from China, whether that geopolitical attention is from the US or South Korea or Japan or others. Second, I said that North Korea provides Beijing with an opportunity to cooperate with other states when China is seeking to assume a mediator or a leadership role. Of course, that dates back to the 6-party talks and most prominently. Third, I say that North Korea offers a potential point of leverage for China. This is sort of the flip side of the second one, and to help extract concessions on separate issues from countries who are seeking China's help to pressure Pyongyang. And of course, we've seen this in the context of US-China relations, and we see it to a large extent in the context of China-South Korea relations as well. And then fourth, sometimes we forget that North Korea is a flashpoint for China with the potential for sparking a regional war that directly affects China's security. And that's really one of the most important bottom lines. And so at any given time, some of these roles are going to be more pronounced than others, but each of them is kind of always present to some degree. And because of that reality, the idea of totally compartmentalizing the China challenge and the North Korea challenge, where issues in the Korean Peninsula can kind of be isolated from increasing tension in the U.S.-China relationship, in my view, simply won't be possible. There will always be linkage. And this is true not only for the United States, but also for South Korea. The most prominent example of this dynamic came during the THAAD dispute, but I think we're likely to see additional instances coming with the new South Korean president as he looks to shift the approach towards both North Korea and China as well. Moreover, because of this reality, we will always need to have kind of an uneasy balance of pressure and engagement with both Beijing and Pyongyang, right? We should avoid constructing our policies on the premise that we can get one or the other to kind of flip on their partner and realign with Washington and Seoul. I think over the course of many decades of these negotiations, we've had variations on this policy where we're either trying to flip China on North Korea or flip North Korea on China. And of course, there is endemic mistrust between China and North Korea. We shouldn't overstate the closeness of the relationship, and that's been true for decades. But I think that ultimately what we've seen is that mistrust pales in comparison to the mistrust those two powers have towards Washington. And then certainly in recent years, as we've seen Chinese leaders Xi Jinping and Kim Jong Un have managed something of a reset in the bilateral relationship, and that's changed the dynamic on some level. Finally, I would say that the inseparability of the China and North Korea issue sets in Northeast Asia means that some sort of major realignment or breakthrough is not likely forthcoming. And as a result of that, US policy should really focus more on problem management rather than problem solving, and seeking evolution rather than revolution in the situation on the peninsula. And so I do think that that view is ultimately relatively consistent with some of the approaches that my other panelists have referred to, where we need to think about how to do this incrementally, but also sort of with our eyes open about what the dynamics at play are.
Thanks, Jake. And we've received a few questions from the audience sort of on a similar topic, and they're basically asking, sort of with the stated goal of the administration still being the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Many people in the audience are saying, that North Korea will probably never denuclearize 100%, and that we should try to, even incrementally working towards it. It's still our ultimate goal. And I understand why it is, but it's interesting also yesterday at just for added context, at a CSIS event, Sumi Terry mentioned, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is also not setting a good precedent for North Korean denuclearization. There's questions, maybe if they had kept their nuclear weapons, maybe Russia would never have attacked, and it's tough to say for sure, but it's certainly not setting a good example on that front for a state that ostensibly claims to have nuclear weapons to prevent that kind of incursion. So I'm curious, with all of that in mind, at the central to the entire concept of diplomatic engagement with North Korea is that there's some form of dialogue that can happen, and so the Biden administration has said that it's willing to come to the negotiating table without preconditions, but it seems that though there hasn't been much progress on that front, even with that stated up front. So I'm wondering, how can we get talks off the ground in the face of this kind of silence, especially, with this sort of mismatch of goals from our two sides. So, John, if you want to start with a stab at this, and maybe I'll come to a few of the rest of you as well.
Sure. It is a really challenging context here when you look at how to get negotiations going with North Korea. And the message has been very consistent from the Biden administration, that the Biden administration is willing to meet and negotiate with the North Koreans. In many instances, radio silence coming from the North Korean side. Reading the tea leaves, I think we're still dealing with the long shadow of the Hanoi summit. And just as a brief recap, I think many of us are familiar with it, but the main elements of it still have this lingering impact to today, where Kim Jong Un put on the table in Hanoi essentially the freezing dismantling of Yongbyon in return for lifting of 5 of the 11 UN Security Council resolution sanctions. That was deemed by President Trump to be insufficient. Essentially, at that point, Kim Jong Un really had nothing else in terms of putting additional components or elements on the table. And we saw the collapse of the Hanoi summit. After that, Kim Jong Un was very consistent in the statements that he's going to develop his capabilities and essentially not be in a position where whatever he puts on the table will be viewed as essentially not paired up. You wouldn't have this kind of apples to apples comparison. And so this is a pretty dramatic step, but something that many in the North Korea watcher community are not surprised by. These are statements. The missiles that he recently tested were in a fairly recent parade as well. And so I think it is a function of, in this instance, North Korea testing those capabilities when it feels it's done, coming to the negotiating table and re-engaging to see what they can get at that particular moment in time. I think that's the hypothesis that we're waiting to unfold and test there. The two key elements there, one is that the North Korean capabilities are becoming more dangerous. If you look at it, right now, the 2 recent tests that they conducted were what we believe to be the Hwasong-17, which is the largest intercontinental ballistic missile that the North Koreans have right now. If they proceed with a space launch vehicle and essentially demonstrate a longer range, the stakes get higher. And so it is something that while it happens, I think we have to stay the course in terms of the different policies in place, but at the same time, get ready when North Korea gets to that stage where they're ready to negotiate. Have something ready in terms of a direct overall picture as opposed to something that would be the initial starting point of a barter system and trying to see what incrementally you can get for one particular item for another. And so this is what I mean by looking at the flywheel effect, where it's slow to get it started in the beginning, but as it ramps up, it gains speed. I think we can reduce that time in terms of getting these type of discussions on the details up and running if we can plan ahead and get ready, and also through the track 1.5s, get a little bit more in terms of context from North Korean participants as well.
Josh, if I can jump in here,
Exactly.
just to add to John's excellent points, I think the most immediate challenge right now is the pandemic. And many of you have either heard or seen me write and say for the past 2 years almost that it's been my working theory from the beginning of the pandemic, and then we've seen more data points along the way. And it really does appear that it seems quite evident North Korea does not want to have any type of direct contact negotiations. Because they are so fearful of importing the virus. I think that's number one. And being based in Seoul, I've been talking to many interlocutors, European, other Asian and Russian also, who are in contact with North Korean officials through their cooperation projects. And it sounds like North Korea is calculating 2024 to be the date where maybe people can start to come back into North Korea when they're overseas. And so if that's any indication, then we might actually still have to be in it for the long haul, if that's any indicator, if they're not going to receive vaccines. And this is where, I've constantly said European partners, Asian allies, Asian partners to try to convince those of you working with North Korean officials virtually through Zoom, which is happening on humanitarian issues, try to convince North Korea that there are safe ways to receive vaccines, and then eventually work your way to try to convince them that there are safe ways to hold direct negotiations with the United States. And so I think that's the first challenge. But even if we were not in a pandemic, John outlined a lot of the challenges, but with what John called the shadow of the Hanoi summit, but I think more fundamentally there, it's tied in, but North Korea has preconditions that they've stated even before the pandemic, and that and they are lifting of sanctions, and they also they've expanded the scope to include no name calling, and also an end to joint military drills. And so they've set the bar so high that I cannot imagine any American administration saying yes to any of those before negotiations. So that's the other point. And and just as a side note, I'm really really excited that John has released his report, and I think our viewers will be able to see any similarities and differences that John and I might both have, either in our own views as analysts, but also in what we've been gathering in terms of research and data and our interpretation of our data, because we both use this values-based metric for a barter system and how to negotiate. And so I think it'd be really interesting for our viewers to take a look and to compare and see the differences or any similarities, and especially for our U.S. government colleagues on the North Korea team, perhaps if they might want to read our report too. A little plug there for both of us. But it really, like John said, it's really going to be challenging, especially with North Korea's nuclear weapons development, in which, by the way, they've made it very clear, at least in public statements and in their actions, that they seem to be unaffected by whatever happens beyond their borders, meaning it's nuclear weapons development business as usual for them. And they've got this 5-year plan. Kim Jong Un has laid out at the 8th Party Congress in 2021, in 5 years, you need to produce and make all these extravagant high-tech weapons, and we're seeing them checking off that list one by one, and it's only a matter of time until we do see, and what John referenced is the monster missile that they paraded in 2020. And that monster missile, many missile experts are suspecting that the only reason why they want to make that is to be able to tip it with multiple nuclear warheads inside. And that's really, we're increasingly, as John said, the stakes are going to be raised, the price tag to negotiate away, even if we go for a step-by-step incremental approach, the price tag will just get higher and higher as time goes by.
I also have a couple quick points I want to add too. One is, I agree with Duyan that COVID is playing a large role in North Korea's reticence to reemerge. But even prior to the COVID lockdown in January of 2020, North Korea was already signaling that it was pulling away because of their dissatisfaction with what they were hearing from the US, right? Basically starting from February 2019 in Hanoi. So I think that's point one, that it's more than just COVID, that there were policy dissatisfactions that North Korea had. The second point is that we're kind of in an uncharted territory, because for 40 years between the end of the Korean War and the early 1990s, it was North Korea clamoring for senior level talks with the US, right? And we always sort of ignored them, discounted them. And then finally in the early 1990s, when they started developing the nuclear program, that's when we agreed to the senior level talks in New York between Arnold Cantor and Kim Jong Un, right? And then we had a similar period of setting high preconditions in order to re-engage during the Obama administration. And now we're in a situation where we have no preconditions, and it's North Korea that has set the preconditions, right? And they're probably looking for some of the corresponding measures that they were seeking after Singapore. They probably felt that they offered a lot of things, like shutting down Punggye-ri, the nuclear test site, dismantling Tongchangi, the missile engine test site, handing over 55 boxes of US service member remains, handing over the 3 US detainees, offering to dismantle Yongbyon, all of these, and the moratorium on the nuclear test and the ICBM testing, right? And they're hoping for something more from the US other than the one-time suspension of exercises in August. So I think we're in a situation now where if we're not going to do more than the current position of offering talks without preconditions, then that may not be enough, right? And if that's not enough, then we have to ask the question, are we satisfied with the status quo? A status quo where North Korea is continuing to destabilize the region, is continuing to develop their military capabilities, continuing to inflict on their population human rights and humanitarian abuses. That's the status quo, and we have to see whether we're ready to live with that situation.
And I'd just like to draw attention to a comment from Marcus Alaskis saying that in the DoD press release that at least part of the monster missile from 2020 was already tested in these last 2 launches, which is, I think, the administration's motivation behind possibly announcing further sanctions tomorrow. But so.
Right, and that there's a difference between, of course, we're going to get really technical here, but yes, it sounds like they've tested components and parts of that so-called monster missile, but Marcus can't speak right now, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen yet any reports or government announcements that they've actually tested the actual missile at full range, obviously. And so, I mean, that's what I meant by it's just going to be a matter of time until they dial up to that full test.
Of course, and by all accounts, it does seem that these past two launches are preparing for something larger, which is, I think, again, spurring this action by the administration. But Jake, I'd like to ask you, and so an interesting point that John makes in his report is that this sort of self-imposed quarantine that North Korea has put on itself since the beginning of COVID, and as we've already discussed, it's not just COVID, it's also just retreating overall. But that self-imposed isolation has, in many ways, been more effective than any sanctions regime that other countries could place on North Korea externally. So, in light of possible announcement tomorrow, Jake, I'm wondering how you view the sanctions toolkit that Washington has left available to it, and sort of how effective you might view that, and where that might bring us in the future.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think there's kind of, it's worth recalling that fundamentally sanctions is about two things. One is trying to compel a change in behavior on the receiving end, and the other is to send a political signal. And certainly, especially not only from administrations, but from Congress, the need to send political signals via sanctions is just as, or if not more important sometimes than the compellence aspect. And I think with the political signaling, it's not always about getting the results you want, but about sending that message. And so that's really kind of the key context, somewhat regardless of the recipient or who's on the receiving end of the sanctions. But in this case, North Korea, my sense is that there's probably, the U.S. is on the cutting edge of sanctions technology, so to speak. But as John has pointed out and others, North Korea is on the cutting edge of sanctions evasion technology, and so that there's something of an arms race there. And then there's a question of, who feels the pain of sanctions, and what the political effect of that internally is. So I think we're, additional sanctions, especially in response to North Korea's behavior, is trying to shape their incentives. I think there would also be an incentive in a negative way if North Korea were to undertake the tests that they've taken and us not impose additional sanctions or take additional action as punishment, to just kind of accept it outright. And so that's not to say we can't think about additional ways to reach out or inducements, but I think we have to pair the pressure with the opening. And I will say, my sense too is part of the Hanoi hangover is the sense in the Korean, the North Korean system, maybe that the kind of way to get business done is to meet with the president. And I think there will be some hangover for that because that's not going to be forthcoming anytime soon, just as it wasn't forthcoming in the decades prior to the Trump administration. And I think I'm not as expert as my other panelists on the North Korean regime, but certainly it's true that that the leader plays a very central role, to put it mildly. And so I think there, you could see a level of mirror imaging where it makes sense to speak in a leader context. And so that's going to be one of the kind of practical obstacles to implement or to having negotiations going forward, is being able to kind of connect at the right level, and especially at the level for those corresponding, doing that bartering that we've talked about, where the technical experts can interface with the folks who can make political decisions about technical issues. And that's where really the rubber meets the road, and where we've seen more successful examples of negotiations with nuclear states, whether it's Iran. North Korea would not consider the Libya example as a successful negotiation, but on the front end it was, that you had much more working level technical experts, but also political, folks who could pair it with the political side to make it viable. And so I think we're pretty far from that. And I don't know if additional sanctions necessarily gets us closer to that point. But I think, there's something to be said for the messaging aspect as well.
Can I ask a question on sanctions? Because we've been talking about this, Jake, and the question is for you, Jake, and also I'm looking at John here, because when John started out in the North Korea space, he was our go-to sanctions expert for a very long time. And even Frank too, do any of you guys know how much effort there's been on from the U.S. government on sanctioning North Korea's cyber crimes and cryptocurrency illicit activities? Because that seems to be really where the game is. I'm clearly not a computer scientist or a financial expert but it sounds like, just a suspicion that I've had is, if we see North Korea's negotiating behavior, I mean, there of course there may be various factors and reasons why they negotiate like this, but I've noticed that under Kim Jong Un, they're less desperate in the sense where they're not pocketing every little concession that America is offering, and they go for the big stuff. And I kind of wonder if one factor could be because they feel more confident or I guess comfortable or not as economically desperate because they're making so much money in cyberspace and in digital means. I mean, clearly, of course, the reports say that these are geared towards their nuclear weapons development to fund nuclear weapons development and finance those. But I wonder if they're also using some of that for their economy or their welfare. I mean, if you have any knowledge on any of that, on sanctioning crypto and cyber crimes.
I don't, but I will want to put in a plug for our colleagues in our energy, economics, and security program, including my colleague Jason Bartlett, who's done a lot of work, in particular on the North Korea crypto issue. And John, am I remembering correctly? You may be doing some work with them, so I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, thank you, Jacob. Absolutely, yeah. Jason has been doing a lot of great research looking at North Korean cyber operations, and Jason and another of our colleagues, Priscilla Marucci, have been very consistent in looking at North Korean cyber operations through the lens of criminal activities, hence law enforcement type of responses. So to your question, there has been U.S. government actions taken, but it's usually a Department of Justice and indictments of those on the North Korean side, the cyber actors who have been involved with cyber theft and so forth. I wanted to add a quick point. What Jake mentioned about the sanctions piece, it's great framing of the two pieces of there. One is the political signaling, and then the second is actually trying to modify and inform North Korean behavior using this very powerful tool of economic statecraft. The main thing here about sanctions is that the US has innovated to the point where if you look at economic statecraft, the United States has honed capabilities that we haven't seen before. Sanctions, if you frame it in a colloquial way, they do hurt. We conducted a 3-year study with Jim Walsh, and this is the report that Jung was mentioning. Key finding from that report was that in the primary space, these sanctions definitely have a very strong impact on the North Koreans. There are major setbacks. But when it comes to the research on this phenomenon, it's in the secondary and tertiary spaces where you see innovation. As some of these North Korean entities try to get back up, they develop new business partnerships, they get into different markets. And so if you imagine the successive application of these really potent, very strong US sanctions, this iterative game and how the North Koreans have been learning, a lot of it is migration into the Chinese marketplace now. Those networks are very sophisticated, and it's a function of the risk affiliated with being sanctioned, being translated by local partners as a business opportunity. So they are offering higher commission fees. The North Korean clients are offering higher commission fees to local Chinese partners, and they get the items that they want, something that was very different from when the North Korean actors were the ones who went to the Middle East, other parts of Southeast Asia to get the equipments directly themselves. The other point I'd mention is that through that lens, I think it's really important to take stock of where we're at with sanctions vis-a-vis North Korea. They are starting to exhibit, not all of them, but the core elements of sanctions application to North Korea are exhibiting a phenomenon of depreciating asset. And big part of that, again, is this migration into the Chinese marketplace. the more we try to apply sanctions on North Korea as it takes place, these activities take place in China, you hit the Great Wall of Sovereignty. The Chinese will not implement US law, as they call it, inside of Chinese jurisdiction. They would abide and implement UN Security Council resident sanctions, but not the very specific US ones. And so with that, and this the view of the sanctions as they increasingly become a centerpiece of how we deal with North Korea, you have this other phenomenon going on inside of the Chinese marketplace. And so this is one of the big motivations for the flywheel effect, looking at essentially developing a comprehensive system of exchange rates, what the North Koreans would get for small actions or large actions, and commensurate in terms of the whole menu that the US has as well. So it's not to say that we're going to do it. It's more putting everything on the table and going through all of these details, because time is of the essence. North Korea is developing capabilities at a pace where the prices for that kind of negotiation, that exchange rate, is going to be more and more favorable to them.
I'd like to jump in with a question from the audience. Mark Mannion is asking whether we see any signs that North Korea would be open to accepting a large-scale COVID aid package from the United States, from South Korea, or the UN. For example, one that would provide enough vaccines to cover all or almost all of its population. And if so, are there any conditions that you think should be attached to that type of package? Frank, if we could start with you.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any signals from North Korea other than, the reports that they seem to be insisting on vaccines that have the mRNA-based vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna. But otherwise, I haven't seen any or heard of any public statements from North Korea indicating an interest in engaging some sort of process or mechanism that would allow them to get those vaccines. But happy to hear from others if they've heard anything different.
So based on discussions with European interlocutors who have direct knowledge, and and of course we've always got COVAX too. So far, it still sounds like North Korea is suspicious and concerned and scared, all of that in one bundle. But the main reason in the beginning, they were eligible for COVAX to receiving vaccines, but the one key stumbling block there was they wanted COVAX to be legally responsible for any adverse side effects and deaths that might occur in North Korea due to the vaccines or in some sort of correlation with the vaccines. And so I think that was one big hurdle that actually put the brakes on any movement towards. And also based on discussions that I've had with other interlocutors who do speak to and actually talk about health issues with North Korean, their health ministry, and apparently there's a vibrant discussion. They want to learn a lot about these vaccines and they ask a lot of questions apparently, but it sounds like they're still hesitant and suspicious in receiving them. And so this is where I really try to encourage my European friends who are in these direct discussions to try to educate or raise awareness and inform them that there are safe ways to do this. And so that's basically all that I have to share right now.
Great. If no one else wants to jump in on that topic, we would be remiss to not discuss the implications of the new presidential election that happened yesterday, and President-elect Yoon, and what his tenure for the next 5 years will mean for both the U.S. ROK alliance, but also the South Korea's relationship with Japan, and South Korea's Seoul's own policy towards North Korea. And just to echo a comment from Ken Gauss in the comments that the new administration in Seoul is not likely to see sanctions relief as a strategy, for example. So obviously lots to consider on that front. So I'd love, Duyan, I'm sure you're chomping at the bit to talk about this topic, and just want to put another plug in for your live tweeting of the election the other day. It was very entertaining and insightful. So
thank you, and all the animations and computer graphics at the end of the tally. So as you can imagine, being in Seoul, it's just really been, very noisy, like dramatic, all that for the past few days, or actually a couple months actually. So bottom line, I think really the alliance will start to work and function more smoothly, the alliance working relationship. the whole lockstep, all that stuff in sync. I think both sides will now be able to freely just call things as they are, call out North Korea's bad behavior just as they are, without sidestepping, without sugarcoating diplomatically too much. So in that sense, yes, I think it's a good thing, and I think the Biden administration would be happy to have an ally now who is more eager to normalize joint drills, eager to strengthen extended deterrence and all that. One challenge that I do foresee, a possible challenge, is Yoon's advisors at a certain point in time, under certain circumstances, they might actually want to go too far towards maximum pressure. And if at that point and under those circumstances, whatever they may be, if the Biden administration does not want to go that far in maximum pressure, then the allies will have to kind of regroup and have a discussion there. When North Korea starts to ramp up provocations, I mean, of course, you're going to hear a crescendo of more hardline voices in South Korea, them wanting their own nuclear weapons, especially if South Koreans, if they see that the Biden administration is, rightfully, understandably so, preconsumed with Russia, Ukraine, and other foreign policy issues and domestic issues. If they feel like the Biden administration is not paying sufficient attention to the North Korea problem, those voices for nuclear weapons are going to crescendo. So Washington will have to deal with that. And so I think there's going to be definite pluses, huge pluses, but also some really, someone mentioned earlier, alliance management, a lot of management issues also that will have to be tended to. And, I think really, for the most part, the other thing will be that, based on how I know Yoon's advisors during the campaign, there are some who will definitely want, if North Korea engages in any type of kinetic provocation, like we've seen in 2010 with the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island or sinking of the Cheonan ship that actually kills South Koreans and soldiers, they're going to want to instantly, immediate retaliate with force without hesitation. And back in 2010, they had a lot of grievances and frustrations that the Obama administration asked for restraint. And so that's another discussion that they're going to have early, before anything like that happens, to have a playbook on what they're going to do and how they're going to deal with those types of situations.
If I could just jump in too, I think it's important to note that conservative administrations in South Korea in the past, like under Kim Jong Un and Park Geun-hye, they've tried to engage with North Korea as well, but on their terms, right? And it was very similar to the strategic patience approach from the Obama administration. But the end result has been that, other than the tail end of the six-party talks that in 2008 that Jung Pak stepped into, there was no formal inter-Korean engagement during the 10-year period of the two conservative administrations between 2007 and 2017. So, I think with North Korea not wanting to engage with potentially not wanting to engage with a conservative ROC administration, and the US and ROC not wanting to bend over backwards to engage with North Korea, we may again be entering another extended period of no engagement, punctuated by significant provocations like we saw potentially in 2010, 2013, and 2016. And I agree with Dian, instead of an end of war declaration or an early transfer of wartime operational control, things that the Moon administration was pushing, was kind of an irritant for the US administrations. I think the Yoon administration will clamor for its own preferences, right? Things like stronger deterrence signaling, the return of more beefed up joint military exercises. And if you have provocations, potentially the return of US deployments of strategic and nuclear assets to the peninsula, which had essentially stopped since the summer of 2018, the strengthening of preemptive strike capabilities, the development of NATO-like consultations for nuclear use, and perhaps even the redeployment of US tactical nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula. Some of these things the Biden administration will support and like, but other things may also serve as irritants.
I think, Frank, you make a lot of good points, but one in particular in the beginning where you emphasized, reminded us that conservative governments have also wanted to engage North Korea. I think that's important to remember. And it's also good, and tagging on to that is every Korean president, left and right, has always wanted to have a summit with a North Korean leader. So we need to remember that too. And so even though we've seen conservatives be more principled and so-called hard-lined, We should not forget that or rule out the possibility that the Yoon administration actually might, in spite of their tougher line, might want a lot more creativity from the Biden administration in terms of how to approach North Korea, and of course in a principled way. But from the perspective of Koreans, they know how North Korea operates. It's top down. So Koreans know, whether you're left and right, that you really got to talk to the Kim leader if you want anything done. So in that sense, I really would not be surprised. We may not hear this publicly, but I would not be surprised if some of his advisors are actually thinking, yeah, at some point under good circumstances, there's going to have to be a U.S. North Korea summit at some point.
I'd love to hear, Jake or John, if you also have some thoughts on this topic, as well as, again, sort of the implications for the South Korea-Japan alliance with the new administration as well, and how that may affect sort of maybe a unified approach to North Korea.
I could jump in first. I wanted to kind of zoom out a little bit, and with the new Yoon administration coming in May, with the new administration, as they develop their policy ideas, as their transition team does a lot of the trips to Washington and so forth, if we zoom out, it's really important, I think, to look at the comparative lens of the U.S.-ROC alliance and the U.S.-Japan alliance, because that's the context in which the Yoon administration will be taking office. The U.S.-Japan alliance has been at the forefront of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And if you look at the Quad, Japan is one of the founding members. The Japanese alliance with the United States has multilateralized, and it's gone Indo-Pacific. And that is leaving a huge gap in terms of the U.S.-ROC alliance. Clearly focused on the North Korean threat, a peninsula-based type of alliance. But in this context, there are going to be greater calls for South Korea to play a larger role. And so I think that is going to be one of the primary tests when it comes to the vision that the Yoon team lays out. Then within that, clearly the longstanding concerns related to North Korea. But here, what the Yoon administration would like to do as they come into office with North Korea is going to have to confront the reality on the ground. And that is the very remarkable integration of relations between China and North Korea. As Jake mentioned, this is not an alliance. This isn't something in terms of an amicable partnership. It's a highly dysfunctional relationship, but transactionally, they've been doing more and more together. And the party-to-party mechanism is really now at a level of institution building. And so if Yoon wants to do something vis-a-vis North Korea, he will have to coordinate with Beijing on this. As much as during the campaign, we've seen some very strong anti-Chinese rhetoric. When it comes to dealing with North Korea, there will be the China factor. So the final thing I mentioned as it relates to the Yoon team and as they start to piece together what they're going to do by way of vision, policy, and then implementation. The other key element here is when you do look at what North Korea has been doing, clearly in the cyber realm. This is an area where, as much as Yoon raised very important points about things going kinetic, North Korea has been highly active in the cyber realm globally, but especially in South Korea as well. And so one of the things I'd like to mention is as the South Korean economy becomes more and more accepting of cyber currencies, cryptocurrencies, and essentially all of the things that deal with the marketplace that is underwritten in many respects by cryptocurrency, there will be a North Korean dimension to all of this. And so the cybersecurity component of it, whereas before it was treated as a non-traditional security issue, it is going to be a pillar aspect. And so how the Yoon team incorporates that into that vision and policy implementation, that's going to be another element of that interaction with North Korea that didn't exist when the previous conservative administration was in power.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I've been interested to see some of the statements about China policy in particular, but I did note in Yoon's article laying out his foreign policy stances in foreign affairs, and I'll quote here, he said, the Chinese government seems to support the denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula rather than just North Korea. You know, speaking of one of those instances where that position might even be more hardline than where we've seen the Biden administration, who's actually softened their phrasing on denuclearization of North Korea versus the Korean peninsula. So it's interesting to see that and have it be such a direct statement. And so sort of returning to what I said at the outset, I do think you'll see something of a hardening there. And my sense of what we've seen from Beijing is that they're willing to respond to that hardening with a hardening of their own. So I think, it will be pretty difficult to get on kind of the same page moving forward because of the integration of the strategic challenges between China and North Korea.
That's a great point. And I think really going ahead, like Yoon and his team are going in, their opening position is hard line towards China, harder line towards China and North Korea. But once he's in office and he's faced with political realities, geoeconomic realities, is he really going to be able to be that hardline and really stand up for China in the way he wants to because of all the stakeholders in South Korea, economic, business, and others, and political. And so we'll have to keep an eye on that and to see if really South Korea is able to stand up and step up to both regional and global issues, or are they going to go back to a bit of a hedging position again and put their head down a bit more often than he wants to initially going in? So we'll have to see.
Josh, I want to address the trilateral issue because you raised it, and I think it's a very important issue because the tensions between South Korea and Japan is an area that policymakers really need to be talking more about. And I know it's a sensitive issue because, one, Washington doesn't want to be perceived as favoring one ally over the other. But two, if we have a deeper historical dive into this topic, it may lead to some discomfort given the U.S. role in the current state of affairs between South Korea and Japan. But I want to offer this. Our decades-long strategy in the region has been to develop a network of alliances and partnerships. And the Biden administration's own Indo-Pacific strategy states that integrated deterrence is a cornerstone of our approach, and that nearly every Indo-Pacific challenge requires close cooperation and coordination among our allies and partners, especially South Korea and Japan. But despite all of this, the weakest link in this approach has precisely been that our two greatest regional allies, South Korea and Japan, aren't getting along, and their relationship remains very cold today. So I think if we're serious about building a regional security network and architecture, we need to devote more time, more serious thinking and action to understanding and improving ROK-Japan tensions. I think with the new Yoon administration, we'll likely see a different approach from Seoul to improve relations with Tokyo. But Seoul's in a pretty difficult situation given the seismic South Korean Supreme Court decision in 2018, which is threatening the 1965 treaty system that has served as the foundation for bilateral relations. And I'm talking specifically about the ruling that allowed South Koreans to claim damages against Japanese companies for forced labor during World War II, because this ruling not only contradicts the Japanese government's position that the 1965 claims agreement settled all claims between the two countries, it also contradicts Japan's position that its colonization of Korea was lawful, right? So these are very fundamental disagreements. In the past, you had conservative South Korean administrations under Park Chung-hee or his daughter Park Geun-hye that prioritized economic and security relations with Japan, but sometimes at the expense of victims' rights, right? And you may see a similar approach from Yoon, but I think it's going to be hard to overturn or supersede the 2018 court decision without undermining the integrity of South Korea's judicial independence. I'm not ruling out the possibility of temporary band-aids like the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement that seemed to kick the victims' rights can down the road a few years, but without a fundamental resolution to the historical issues between the two countries, I don't think the U.S. will ever be able to achieve an optimal version of its desire for an integrated regional security network.
Yeah, those are excellent points. Just to add, their going in position is, they want to compartmentalize, right? Deal with history issues on one track, and on the other track, do the trilateral and other cooperation on mutual interests and concerns. I think a challenge there would be the South Korean government's hands might be tied if Tokyo does something to upset both the South Korean government and the South Korean people. Now, if something happens in Japan that upsets the South Korean public and the public is up in arms, I think that's going to make it difficult for the government itself to engage in a lot of these cooperation activities with Japan, even though it wants to. And so in that sense, in that situation, I think it would be, if it's possible, again, I've seen this happen once during a conservative government previously, that they still engaged in GSOMIA trilateral activities, but in private. They never publicized it to the public, because it was at a time when anti-Japan sentiment was quite hot in the public. And then people, I mean, some of us knew at the time because we were told this in private, but it was never made public until like much later, until the dust settled, basically. And so if they're able to do things like that, then I think we might have, and to really, this is real compartmentalizing, doing things in private, but it's difficult to have everything classified, right? Because as everyone here knows, I don't have to spell that out. But so, I think there are going to be some challenges there too.
Well, thank you all. I'm noticing we are now actually 1 minute over our stated end time of 7 o'clock. So I would just like to sincerely thank the four of you for joining us tonight, and also to the audience members for sticking with us until 7 Eastern time at least. And for your thoughtful questions and lively discussion in the chat as well. Is really interesting to see that. So thank you all. If you want to learn more about these topics, feel free to head over to cnas.org. We have lots of reports from the likes of our panelists today. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you again so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care all.